and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center. Today our guest is Yevhenii Monastyrskyi. He is a lecturer at the Kyiv School of Economics. He is also a PhD student at the Harvard University, and his focus lies in the history of the Soviet Union and sociology of the war. Today we speak with Yevhenii, thank you for having joined us, on how much of the Soviet Union and Soviet history surrounds us and what are the implications of that?
The Soviet heritage is actually surrounding us in way more senses and ways we can imagine, because in Eastern Europe at large we have a remnants of both Soviet terror and Soviet rule. All the way from mass graves we have all around Eastern Europe where the people killed by the Soviet regime or we also have those buildings and streets and basically the everyday social systems organized by the Soviet rule at some places more like say Belarus or Ukraine or Russia, part of the Baltic states, or less in other way, say in Poland or in East Germany, because in East Germany this will be either situation as one we are right now, so those buildings and those organizational system of the urban spaces, which is basically a Soviet heritage, or if we go further from Berlin, from like basically the capital-ish economical system, which still support in those highly inefficient buildings. We go further to the Polish border, say to Frankfurt am der Oder, and we will see basically buildings which never been restored since the Second World War. They're still standing as they like part debris, and this is also part of the Soviet heritage in this country. But in the same time, the further in the west you go, at some places in Eastern Europe, you also have a Soviet heritage in the way of the streets names. You also have those in the memory of everyday life, in everyday life, in the monuments. But also you see this in the attitude of, say, Germans, especially East Germans, to Russia, and in their self-perception of where they are in the history of 20th century, for say.
We are now at Alexanderplatz and in Berlin, and that is where like all these Soviet like structures are here, the Soviet buildings. Is it like what we have in daily life, what we don't notice, we take it as a natural habitat?
Yeah, to a certain extent, there's an old hypothesis in the history of urban development about the monuments around which there is no festivities. So the Soviets, not only Soviet, basically any kind of organization of urban space, especially if there are like some names or monuments are around which are celebrated in the history of the named country or the named nation, usually those monuments play the significant role in the urban space. Say Siegessäule in Berlin, which is
the column which has been erected to celebrate victories of the First Reich.
Yeah, and it's still a very much celebrated place, and lots of things going on around that. And though not everybody remembers why this thing is there, but everybody noticed those places. But some monuments, when festivities are not there anymore, they just disappear from this everyday kind of our location. So like not far from here, there is a monument to Marx and Engels, this old couple anecdotal thing. And now it's basically an anecdotal monument. Nobody is doing anything. Nobody or maybe like sometimes some weird people.
But the monument to Marx and Engels is still there.
Yeah, it's still there.
It's not removed.
It's not functions, and it's not functioning anymore as a Sehenswürdigkeit, and it's not function as a memorial important to the civilians, aside from some weird people who lay I don't know, flowers sometime on some anniversary there. say 40 years ago, it was a very important monument, and like there were specific festivities around this monument, and like any other place in for instance the Soviet ideological system or the communist ideological system, there are usually places around which there are certain movements of people, certain organized celebrations. There are some mournings. There are some any kind of organized ideological movement. If it's not there, the usual theory says people stop noticing those monuments. It's maybe not as visible in say East Germany, because there's actually those monuments usually are not as big and as central as, for instance, in former Soviet republics, in Belarus, in Ukraine, and Russia. When you at some point, like 15 years ago, you go to any I don't know, the regional center, and you will have like 5 Lenin monuments, and nobody noticed them. They may be standing in the center of the main square, but nobody have any reason to understand what the hell is going on.
Because it's too big and too obvious.
And nobody doing anything with this anymore. Like there are no pioneers making an oath and standing in front of this monument anymore. So therefore, people just acting as this is just a furniture standing in.
But wait, like this is like about the monuments, which are very very special constructions. Mm-hmm. But when we talk about the decorations of the buildings, we still have in Berlin a lot of Soviet mosaics. If you go further from Berlin to, let me say, Dresden or other former Eastern German cities, we have a lot of them, like praising even Lenin or Marx and Soviet soldiers. We have the names of the streets, and these all monuments are still here.
Those things are a different kind of monuments. So this is a commemorational. If we're talking about the street names, this would be the commemorational practices. So like when and there's another problem arise with like those names becoming an outdated thing when there's like less and less people who really understand who are those people, who are those people this street this was named after. This is one thing, especially if there's like very local, very specific story behind it, which is usually been taught to those pioneers who was taking oath to the Lenin monument at some point. Later on, it's just losing its sense, and it's just becoming this sign of the former Soviet occupation. If we're talking about those mosaics, for instance, or like any kind of artistic manifestation of the ideological structures basically hanging around there, those again played another role in the everyday life. Again, this is mostly the assertion of the ideology in the urban space. And if it's not functioning anymore in any kind of communication with the people who live in this city, who have any value in those say mosaics, it's also stopped meaning anything. But it begin to remind them something else. They start to think that those things are maybe of an artistic value. They are maybe of some historical value, and maybe they are saying something about the history of the place. And that's why you have reluctance to talk about, or do we need those things in our urban space?
That is an amazing point. We will definitely come back later to this point. But before, don't forget to subscribe to this video channel to get informed as the first person about videos and interviews like that. Don't forget to like, to share, and please comment, say what you think about what we're discussing here. But Yevhenii, that is, I think, is a very important moment, because in all these mosaics and monuments and street names, we have 2 aspects. Please correct me if I'm wrong. The first one is the aspect of ideological aspect, like spreading, in this case, the communist ideology. That's why Lenin, that's why red banners, that's why all these symbols. And another aspect is colonization. Because in all these territories in Eastern Germany, but not only, in all Eastern European countries, in Ukraine, in Belarus, also in Central Asian countries which have been occupied by Russia, they always had the Russian aspect in these mosaics and this name. We have all the Pushkin streets, we have like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Gagarin, we have Russian soldiers like in the monuments. So it is a double hate line from the left side, from the right side. On one hand, we have the be communist because communism is good, and on another hand, don't forget that the best communists are the Russians.
And there's also the third side. You're right. There's a third side which is very specific to the German context, and this is the creation of a notion of the victimhood of the East Germans, because the idea of the DDR, of the GDR, was that Germans who are under Soviet occupation were actually victims, the Opfer, of the Nazi regime, and never been fascist. So like when GDR arrives, it's intrinsically and in a certain way, and then it's pronounced as a anti-fascist state.
So they were all anti-fascist all the time during the Hitler. They were anti-fascist. Then the Soviets helped them to.
It's basically a mirroring situation with the West Germany. When in West Germany it was kind of other kind of deal with the basically Nazi elite and like Nazi heritage. When it was denazification, but also kind of pacification of all the Nazi heritage. It was kind of thrown under the rug. In East Germany, it was kind of turned basically the perpetrator was turned into victim. And in this case, Soviets, and not just and Soviets, of course, in the form of Russians and Russian speakers, of course, as the sole lingua franca of the Soviet Union. The Soviets came here as a rescuer. They're like as in Treptover Park.
So it was not an occupation.
Yeah.
It was a liberation. Of course, for all those who were in concentration camps, it was a liberation, of course. But then another sort of subjugation came.
And exactly. So, like in case of East European states, when this during the Second World War, Soviet army was passing through those states, every capital had this medal for the liberation of Prague, of Warsaw, of Königsberg, and like the for Königsberg it was taken of Königsberg. So this is like and taken of Berlin. So this is, but at the end of the day, the celebration of this of the end of the Second World War for East Germans by the Soviets were sold as a liberation.
But that is, I think, it's a very important aspect, because we all know how important for us in Germany is the idea of rejection of the Nazi past, and understanding that the Nazi regime was an evil terror regime, which like one of the worst regimes, if not the worst regime of the 20th century, and having killed a lot of people, like perpetrating genocide on industrial scale, never seen before. And that's why I think it's also very hard to say, okay, like if we have a Soviet monument of a Soviet soldier, we cannot remove it because who will celebrate it most? The neo-Nazis. And we don't want it, of course. But at the same time, if we see, and that is this colonialism aspect, the Soviet monuments are always being installed as the Russian monuments, and they have been hijacked by the Russian Federation after that. If we remember the 1992 treaty between Germany and Russian Federation was seen by United Germany, as a legitimate owner of all Soviet monuments, including Ukrainian soldiers, Belarusian soldiers, Tajik soldiers, Georgian soldiers.
But this is the other side of the Soviet colonialism. So like and this was the problem of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. When Soviet Union fell apart, basically Russia Russian Federation became the sole successor of the Soviet Union, while other 14 republics were basically left out hanging, like without like getting their independence, but not getting their piece of the pie. So like this is and also outside of the Soviet Union. So like this is the Russia basically inherited all the network of the institutions and influence outside of the former Soviet Union, and they basically instrumentalized it in this way to the point when till today, say in Germany or in Baltic states, Russian diaspora or people of Russian descent claiming their right on certain monuments, on certain memorial sites, and it's sometimes it turned into like even like the urban violence when there are people who are say in Estonia trying to basically instigate that they will attack the Estonian government when it will be removing or moving the monument to this Soviet unknown soldier.
And it was the first case with the so-called bronze soldier,
yes.
Right? It was the first such attempt in, I think, 2010, 2008 maybe.
7, I think. Well,
maybe
but then
even 7, even earlier, but it was the first one in Europe. But that is extremely important detail you have brought into discussion. Now Russia tries to revitalize these monuments, to recycle them, and to use them as crystallization points for its agents. Here in Germany, we know every year pro-Russian groups gather in Treptow Park in Berlin with the Soviet monument, with the Stalin quotes, and they celebrate, or they tried at least before the police stopped them, they tried to celebrate the Russian war of genocide against Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. But this is not only happening in Berlin, it's also happening in Vienna, for instance, where you have like the same type, a little bit smaller on the scale, but the same type of Soviet soldier with the Stalin quotes standing in the center of center in Vienna. So like you have those monuments also in Bulgaria. You have those like this Alyoshka. You have those monuments all over the place, except for those countries like Poland or Ukraine, which get at a certain point started to get rid of them.
And that is a question: why did Ukraine manage to remove Lenin's status, but you still have like Ernst Thälmann in Berlin?
Well, like this is like moment of the division. Like people like Ernst Thälmann or Rosa Luxemburg or Karl Liebknecht or any other communist activists of the pre-Nazi era. Or even during the Nazi occupation or Nazi regime, those people who were in underground movements, they were like actual German politicians. And this is like very important historical point to say that we can have our problems with communist ideology, and we can despise them. We can say that we can agree or disagree. But when we're talking about the politicians in a certain country in the historical context, we are. I don't think we are able to exercise liberty to say that they are all like Soviets or Bolsheviks or whatever, because they were actual politicians, and the way Soviets decided to commemorate them, this is another discussion. So, but the way that's like Germans have right to commemorate their actual politicians, not those installed by Soviet Union, by Soviet occupation. This is the moment when the differentiation has to come. The other side is, what about Walter Ulbricht? And like, are there monuments to Walter Ulbricht, or are they coming anytime soon?
Not to my knowledge, but we still had like until recently we had like Lenin bas-reliefs in Berlin. Then they were removed, but it's a long story. But anyway, we still have quite different attitude, not only in Germany, in Europe overall, maybe except of the Baltic countries and Ukraine, quite different attitude to communist symbols. Like you can easily walk around the street with hammer and sickle, with the communist symbol. You can even wear like Soviet uniform. You have like all these actors on the streets here in Berlin wearing Soviet uniforms. You will make a photo with them. Like nobody comes to an idea and say, I will wear like an SS uniform for the tourists, although there will be plenty much of tourists who would gladly make these photos, believe me, but they will not come to this idea because it is weird and it is even criminal. So why are the communist symbols which have killed so much people here, who put people in concentration camps, who practiced mass executions, illegal imprisonment and other terrible things, why are these symbols are being tolerated?
Well, again, because the way Soviet Union and Soviet occupation was treating, for instance, Germany, because things you're saying are kind of eligible and possible mostly in Germany, maybe in Austria. It's very hard to imagine somebody will be tolerating this in, say, Poland or Czech Republic or Slovakia. Maybe in Slovakia they will be more like more or less just indifferent to them. This is kind of their memory politics, their development, which is kind of remarkable. But here in Germany, again, we going back to this idea of the victim of the Nazi regime that created here in East Germany, in East Berlin, and this is why the dressing up as a Soviet soldier or wearing hammer and sickle is okay, because this is the sign of the liberation. And in Poland, Ukraine, to a certain extent in Belarus for some people, and especially in Baltic states, this is the sign of the occupation. And in Ukraine, this radical break with the Soviet heritage was possible only because of the revolution, because this was the moment when
the revolution of dignity,
the revolution of dignity of 2013-14. So like, this was only possible because this was a radical break from the past, radical break from the Russia, and from this perspective, those Lenin's monuments were perceived as basically a places of power of Russia, the places of influence of Russia, and this was the moment when Lenin is no more. It doesn't mean anything. It's not only doesn't mean anything as it was for like 20 years. It becoming a problem. It becoming something which disrupts the public space.
The same point of crystallization of Russian influence, like some Soviet
because for instance, Baltic states or Poland had very close memory of their interbellum independence, and that Soviets are occupied their country, and they had very strong diaspora, say in Europe or Canada or United States, depending on which country you take, and they had very directed move towards the dismantling these places of Soviet memory, because for them it was clear-cut occupation. And for instance, for Ukraine, it was the longer discussion.
And one of the most favorite ways of the Soviets to install the monuments was to install them in the form of a tank. We know all these tank monuments, even here in Berlin, but in all capitals, it's always a Soviet tank being installed in the center of the city.
Funny way, in my hometown in Luhansk, there was in the center of the city, it's British tanks from the First World War, which were given as a present to Voroshilov at some point after when already in 30s. So like they're British Mark V First World War tanks. Soviet tank is staying outside of the city. But you're right. This is the way it was organized in every big city in Ukraine. You have like. In the center, for instance, of my hometown of Luhansk, there are still 5 monuments to Lenin, only in the center. Not every citizen know all of them, but like if you make people think, like for instance, there's a monument to young Lenin in the Komsomol Park, and not everyone knows that this is Lenin, because it's just lost.
Just some boy.
Yeah, it's just, and this is very important. Those monuments losing sense. And for Ukraine in 2013-14, this was a moment of radical break, because they're not just losing sense. They now becoming something foreign, something something outside of our values, of our meaning, and that's why the break came in, same as it came earlier in Poland or Baltic states.
Wow, that is amazing. Like, just imagine 5 Lenin monuments, including a child Lenin in your city, and so many Lenin monuments that you don't even remember how much you have. And here we come to the next question, but before we do this, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, don't forget to like, to share, and please comment. So, Yevhenii, we have already discussed that in Ukraine there have been, after the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-14, the movement to remove this Soviet, actually Russian presence in urban space, monuments, street names, etc. But could you elaborate more on that? Like, how was that used to impose this colonial rule on Ukraine? Because my favorite example, a friend of mine told me, I think from Uzhgorod, a city in far west of Ukraine, close to Slovakia, he said to me, we had a Pushkin street and Pushkin monument, but Pushkin has never visited our city and maybe never knew about the existence of our city. But the Russians, they don't have that much Pushkin and Gagarin streets in their country compared to the number of Pushkin and Gagarin streets in Ukraine itself.
This is about the canon of the this is about ideological canon. Soviet rule was installed at some points, in different points, and this is very important because those waves of renaming streets in the not only in Ukraine but also on all of the parts of the colonized parts by the Bolsheviks, they were happening at some points to for instance, the anniversaries of passing of death of Pushkin. This was one of his 100th anniversary of the death of Pushkin was one of the first waves of those renamings, and those renamings, though we can think of them as a wicked plan to install something. This is what sometimes, and in a lot of things, it was more or less filled with deep thinking than we wanted to see. So it's probably a little bit less of the vicious plan than we see. What do I mean by that? So those waves of renaming were happening in a certain organized way of the plan.
We never renamed thousands or hundreds or dozens of streets on Lesser Ukrainka on the 100th anniversary of the death.
No, but because again, this is about the domination of the culture. So the Russian speaking and Russian language culture, because there are Gogol streets. Gogol being Ukrainian. But in the Soviet canon, he was writing in Russian. Therefore, he's Russian. This is the basic argument, and this goes all the way to all of those streets renaming. This is a imposition of the cultural influence. So the Pushkin is our everything, as they say in Russian. And therefore, it has to be your everything too. Your national writers and poets comes in second, and this is kind of reversed situation as for instance, the party rule in each republic. Usually in Soviet times, in those Soviet republics, the rule of thumb, though not always executed this way, was that the first secretary is the representative of the national or dominant nation, so Ukrainian or Georgian or Kazakh.
But the second one.
But the second is Russian.
So everything is a Russian.
Yes, but the second secretary usually responsible for everything important and everything, and basically a CEO of the republic would be Russian, and would be maybe not even born in this republic. So this is kind of a way the Soviet ideological system was organizing its imposition of power. From one side, there are always people who have loyalties, and have loyalties to the metropoly, not to the periphery of the imperium.
But then back to this Pushkin Street,
Yeah.
because here, like in the West, in Germany in particular, when Ukrainians started to rename the streets and like remove these hundreds of Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky, and other streets and renaming them, then there was like an outrage. It said like all the Ukrainians want to cancel the Russian culture, but it is not about the canceling culture. It's about like getting rid of these signs of dominance.
Absolutely, like this is the cry about the canceling of Russian culture coming from those liberal Russians who are basically living in this ostrich position. They pretend that's most of Russians in Russia are against war. They pretend that their anti-war effort actually mean anything, while they're being the same agents of the imperial mindset. So they are creating this narrative of Russia bashing, basically to call themselves a victim again. So like this is a perpetrator calling themselves a victim in the way they were calling Germans victims.
And then there comes the question like, where is your great Ukrainian-speaking writer from the 19th century? Of course, there was nobody, because it was forbidden to print books in Ukraine.
No, there are famous Ukrainian writers of 19th century, and like they're.
No, I mean like those who were like printed like massively
and translated in other languages. This is another problem, and this is the problem of imperial influence. So like we don't have a lot of translations of Ukrainian poetry, for instance, of the 20th century, simply because it was the whole generation of Ukrainian avant-garde writers and poets was perished in the Great Terror, so-called executed Renaissance, and this is the problem, because you go to any museum of the modern art, you go to Amsterdam, you go to Berlin, or to Paris, and you will have this Russian avant-garde as a buzzword for any kind of avant-garde. Basically, like the avant-garde is associated with Russia, though. Part of the so-called Russian avant-garde with people from Ukraine, and same goes with the avant-garde literature, which was amazingly presented by, say, Semenko or Johansson. So, like there are Ukrainians in this story. They are just underrepresented because they were killed by the Soviet imperial power. So same goes for 19th century, same goes basically through the whole Soviet period. There's a immense love to Brodsky and Solzhenitsyn, but somehow there's no immense love to Stus, who were no less a victim of the system, maybe even more.
Has died in prison and practically killed in prison.
He was killed
under Gorbachev.
Yeah, he was killed in Gulag. Yeah, so and this is a very important moment to understand. That's like for Ukrainians. We have less problem with Pushkin or Dostoevsky, for that matter, though we have problem of those things being overrated, let's say. But there's nobody canceling Russian culture. It's more about the reevaluation of the meaning of those things for us, and again, for us, those things are markers of empire, and we kind of want to get rid of the markers of empire, and because this is the anti-colonial thing we kind of want to execute.
But it is like it's a typical situation when like one group is dominating over another group, and this group requires equality. The first group cries of cancelling.
Yes,
despite the fact that what this colonized group wanted is the equality. But I think it is a very important thing you have mentioned, like this destroying of culture by killing and by violence, and then claiming this territory as yours. I think, is it not what Russia is doing now with like renaming streets in occupied territories in Ukraine, installing their monuments like Alexander Nevsky and others?
No, they're definitely doing that, and they're definitely, but doing this in a way less subtle manner than Soviet Union was doing that. And maybe it will sound as a compliment to Soviet Union in this case, because like Soviet Union had very rigorously organized ideological, let's say, guidelines how to do those things. Russia is basically doing whatever they like in local circumstances. They install they install weird and actually not artistic because some Soviet monuments are actually were done by good artists.
But okay, like during 80 years you may find something.
Yeah. There's actually like it's still ideological zikkurat, but it's kind of it was done by like you go to Ukraine and you see, for instance, this Artyom monument in Svetohirsk in Donetsk Oblast, and it was done by Kvaleridze, and Kvaleridze was amazing sculptor, and though it is still a Soviet monument to.
And Artyom was a butcher, like who killed a lot of people in Bashkortostan, and he came to Ukraine.
And he was absolutely like the product of this. He was basically a warmonger among communists, and he was absolutely crazy person. And yeah, but this monument is still a piece of art. And there are like those copy-paste monuments. And today, Russia installing those weird monuments in occupied territories of Ukraine, or renaming streets after some wacky local. Like basically local separatists or the collaborators. This is their way, of course, to mark the place, to say that they are here for good. But in fact, they're doing this in a such unorganized manner, in such actually superfluous manner that you don't see this as a huge threat. You see this as a joke, especially like from Ukrainian side. It's of course a violation of any norms of war. But again, for us, the more important thing is the following the war crimes and following the execution of the local activists, for instance, or local population per se, which is happening on occupied territories en masse. And this is absolutely a genocide. However, those renamings are just another proof of how Russia trying to be something that they are not, trying to be ruler over the place which they actually cannot organize rule over of. So like this is kind of a complicated story about how the Russian occupation is actually hanging by a thread, and it's hanging by this symbolical moves which are very easily can be taken down very easily, especially since in Ukraine we have a lot of experience of demystification of those imperial sites. And this is very important to understand this. If this experience of demystification and demythologization of those things is in place, you basically have an antidote against against this imperial narratives which are been thrown by Russia at any given place, not only in Ukraine but also outside. And this is the reason why Ukrainians, especially those who are outside of Ukraine right now and say traveling France or Germany or Austria, and they're so sensitive towards those little things we see. We see those small monuments, we see those people with the hammer and sickle on their t-shirt, and this is and for us this is the symbol of the genocide, and this is why there's a certain level of outcry from the Ukrainian, say, civil. It's weird to say, but Ukrainian civil society outside of Ukraine because we have the experience of self-organization probably on a scale not a lot of nations in Europe has in the last 10 years, and that's why the calls from the Ukrainian
society. The challenges and threats that the Ukrainian society faced are unprecedented.
Exactly.
And of course, like instead of listening to the Ukrainians, many in the West say, "Oh, you are over emotional, you're overreacting, you don't understand, you're not deep enough, etc." All these things that have been talked also in front of the full-scale invasion by Russia.
Exactly, and this is what, for instance, happening here in Berlin with like the whole conversation about the Treptower Park and like our Ukrainians also need to lay flowers on the May 8th in the Treptower.
May Ukrainian flags be celebrated.
Yes, and this is like, and for us, this is also a question like, from one side, there are Ukrainian soldiers. And there are people of like there are Ukrainians who fell in millions, and like the second largest portion of national portion of the Soviet army, which perished in the Second World War, were Ukrainians, of course. But in the same time, this is a question of what does it mean for us that those people were part of this, basically an imperial machine? Are those people, all of those people were quote unquote Soviet patriots? And this is, and another question would be what those things mean for us today. It doesn't mean that we don't want to commemorate Ukrainians fallen in the Second World War, but we want to commemorate all Ukrainians fell in the Second World War who were fighting.
Can you imagine what sort of a war monument can be installed in Berlin for the victims of the war from the Soviet side, but not glorifying the Soviet regime?
Yes, of course. Like this, and this could be an effort, and this could be like a joint effort, not only by Ukrainians, by Poles, by Belarusians, by Baltics, by the nations of Transcaucasia and Central Asia, because there are multiple nations fallen in the Second World War, also as a part of the Soviet army, and whose memory not always means celebration of the Soviet victory, because for them, say Baltic states, or say Western Ukraine, or say Poland, the victory of the Soviet Union also meant the occupation and the following, basically following genocidal events as the deportations, for instance, in the case of Poland, also in the case of Ukraine, also in the case of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. So like this means that the victims of the Soviet regime, it's not always people directly killed by Soviet regime, but also sometimes recruited to fight for a Soviet regime. As for instance, when we think about and this is like drastic change of topic, but it's also about war. Think of the Soviet-Afghan war. And there's a certain problematic still exists in lots of countries which used to be part of the Soviet Union or part of the Warsaw Pact, of the status of those veterans who fought for Soviet Union in the Afghan war, especially those in Baltic states or in Ukraine, and the problem is that those people probably could be or probably should be regarded as the victims of the Soviet regime, because basically Soviet Union forcibly recruited them to fight an unjust war, and at
the same time they can be war criminals.
Yeah, and
under
international law they are war criminals, of course, because like the things Soviet Union did in Afghanistan are like obviously, and this is unjust war, and this is
where is the exit? Like you have already mentioned, demystification of history, demystification of the monuments is the only way out. Is a very cold-minded historical work, or is art also
no, it can be anything, because like cold-minded historical work is boring to death for lots of people, and it's also it also doesn't make any sense without the conversation with a wider audience. And here we need a combination of factors. Of course, there should be conversation among historians about the meaning of things, the memory of things, and organization of those, say, urban spaces, of the street names, which things are valuable for the national memory, or which things are just the remnants of the Soviet occupation regime, as debris of the never restored buildings in the Frankfurt am der Oder, for instance. And from another side, this should be a public conversation with the wider audience, and knowing the rule of conduct here in Germany also has to be like very, and it will be, if it's ever happened, a huge discussion on the local level, as the local politics matter a lot, and this would be more of a driver from the locals, and also conversation within the political parties and political movements, because of course you have Die Linke, who basically to a certain extent the Russian proxy were still, like there are huge question marks around that, and there's SPD, which is also Social Democrats parties, which is also sometimes functions very protectively towards the Soviet heritage, and which is okay, which is fine. This is not a problem, but discussion should happen in kind of honest conduct of what does those things mean on a larger scale, of course, of Germany per se, but also on a European scale. If Germany want to claim their leading place in European Union, it's also meaning listening not only to valuable partners on the West, but also on the countries in the East, which has way different experience of the Soviet occupation and way different reflection of the Soviet occupation. Because if you go today to Poland, it's not far from here, and you will talk to locals in any part of Poland, you will hear pretty drastic things about the Soviet occupation. Not to say if you go to Baltic states or Ukraine, and it's harder to imagine here, especially in east part of Germany, and this is not a surprise, because the amount of resources, also military resources, Soviet Union poured into this region, particularly to inflict fear and inflict this victimhood, this victimhood which pays dues to Russians as a collective thing of the Soviets, and this attitude towards Russian it's psychological. It's pretty understandable, because this is how memory plays out in this case. In people, especially of older generation, may have this sentiment because it was inflicted, say, I don't know, from the schoolyard. Like you see, like you go from this building and you see those ugly panel buildings, but you still can imagine how 40 years ago it was basically high-class buildings, and this is what basically DDR gave those people, like maybe believe in the
moving from a coal-heated small house built before World War II into more.
But also of the social lift. So like you can become something out of nothing, but everybody forgetting what the cost of the social lift was. For other people to say, but also that these transformations were also done with the tongue in cheek. So like they were also done in a way it's kind of not giving Germans any kind of actual good life, and that's why that, like, as I think we were talking, like there's this icon. There was this iconic sign on the side of the Museum Insel, die DDR hat uns nie gegeben, and this is very like the GDR has not gave us anything, and this is very important starting point for the conversation, which is sometimes still already happening in Germany. It's just happening on, sometimes on marginalia. It's not became a public discussion. That's like the GDR wasn't actually a kind of good thing. And this
well, on this point, I'm sure we could like continue this conversation for another hour and talking about the German guilt towards Russia, not towards the older nations of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. How did it affected the German perception of Ukraine before the Russia's full-scale invasion? I would gladly do this, but maybe we'll do it next time. Don't forget the main lesson from this conversation and from all insights by Yevhenii. We need to demystify the history. We need to understand what all these monuments bring us, why they have been installed, and how we look at them. This was Yevhenii Monastyrskyi, who is a lecturer at the Kyiv School of Economics. He's also a PhD student at the Harvard University. He's a historian and sociologist, and the focus of his study is learning what are the war impacts on our societies and what was the Soviet history. Don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe, and to leave your comments. Thank you so much.